When they say, I want my lawyer, you tell them, shut up.
Your time is
Don't
expired.
get a lawyer.
Coming at you with subversion.
Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans?
No, sir.
The state is an institution of theft writ large. Tax is just about a system where politicians and bureaucrats steal money from their citizens to squander in the most disgraceful manner.
The Republic will be reorganized into the first galactic empire for a safe and secure society.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Hi, I'm Nick. I play music in a number of groups. Currently, like I said, I always joke, I have to have 7 or 8 bands or I'd get bored with what I was doing in any one of them. I make money off of cover bands just because there's money to be made and it's better than working in a factory. I have a 70s progressive band that's all Genesis, Yes, Steely Dan kind of stuff. And then an acoustic duo where I make most of my money, honestly, because we're a bunch of portly white guys that go out and play R&B and hip-hop songs. As far as original music goes, I do the Burns to the Soul thing, which is the moniker I go under for the, my solo stuff. Currently, as far as bands go, I have I don't want to say post-hardcore, but post-rock, kind of hard rock thing called Puma Thurman. I'm meeting together with like a surf killers kind of thing today, and then I've got another Queens of the Stone Age meets White Stripes kind of thing that's underway right now. So I think really 3 original projects that I've got going, aside from like a solo thing.
Damn. Yeah, you told me that you've got a lot of stuff going on, but I mean...
with a wife, a kid, and a full-time job.
Jeez, man. I mean, I think I'm busy, but jeez, that's a lot of stuff.
Most of them, the key is just to try and get as much thing into autopilot as possible. Like you say with my acoustic project for booking, I have, bookings out through the end of 2018 now. It's just setting up those once a month or once every other month, and then you just let that go on autopilot. You get towards the last quarter of the year, and you say, are we doing it next year? They go, yep, okay. And so you can start booking around it that way. I don't need, when you're playing every week with a band, there's really no need to practice because you're always playing shows.
I'm sure there's like an equilibrium that it comes to when you're playing in a band where yeah, it's just your shows become your practice.
You need to get together if you have to learn new material, but, depending on what it is, how often is that?
I kind of wanted to, before we get real deep into your specific material that you're making now, perhaps we should just ask kind of where you're coming from. Tell the audience a little bit about your origin story, sort of growing up, and how you got into music.
Well, that's almost as complicated as every other part of my life. I was originally from Florida, outside of Tampa, and we moved up probably about 4 years old to get away from the kind of life that I think my family was living in Florida at that point in time. Depends who in the family you ask why that happened, but so I grew up in rural New York. I to give people a scope of how rural. I'll say my school district in high school had 86 kids in my graduating class.
Oh wow, that's sorry to interrupt, but that's about the size of my graduating class as well.
Yeah, and it could take you about an hour to drive across from the district from one end to the other to get that many kids.
I think the more northern and upstate New York sort of gets forgotten. When people say New York, they just think of the city, and that it's just this metro, liberal place, but they just they shadow the rest of the state, which has its own kind of rich heritage and everything.
Well, I always joke with people, if you take away New York City, it's a red state. Without question, New York is a conservative state, minus one city.
It just so happens to be one of the biggest, port cities historically, so it just boomed.
I don't know how much you know about New York politics, but every couple years somebody brings up, just like in California, the amendment to make New York City its own state and have New York be its own state, because when you have, in much the same way all the flyover states kind of get boned, you have a state legislature that's making judgments about a place that nobody's ever seen. Like, it has a completely different, like, how many people in New York City can make legislation that takes into position farms when they've never seen a farm? And that's all New York State is outside of the city.
I guess just to get out of the way, Nick, you're the first sort of person on this particular segment of this show where I've stopped being politically sanitized on this show. So I think we should just come right out and say that we're both very hardcore libertarians, from what I notice. The Mayor de Blasio, I saw that interview that he did with, I think it was the New York Times or some big media agency, and man, that he was talking about some just straight up communist and socialist things that he wants to do. Like, he's talking openly about how, oh yeah, people want a big government, and we should just like centrally plan all of this stuff, and we got to have rent control, even though, obviously rent control has historically shown, even people like Paul Krugman have said that rent control doesn't work. So it's like, so that's the kind of like leadership that the city of New York has, is people like Mayor de Blasio who are completely open about all of this, what we historically see as tyranny. I mean, I think McCarthy would have thrown this guy in jail forever.
Oh, without question. I mean, the worst part about it is that if you look at the way the city is, I can't say that I think he's wrong. I do think that is what those people want. To me, it sounds just absolutely reprehensible, but
But yeah, so and then I guess that sort of begs the question. I mean, we're probably both for secession, I would imagine, right?
Secession of the individual is the goal, right?
Yeah, I'm into that. I like taking it to that level. But federalism's a start, and I guess if I were in upstate New York, I would probably want to have a secession movement from New York City.
And while all of that seems off topic on a music podcast, to me it's very on topic, because that leads me to coming up in music. As a teenager, I think I fronted my first band at 14 years old. It was a punk band called the Decoys, and that gave me my first taste of actually performing out. A few years later, I started doing that while doing the cover gigs stuff, because no better way to make money as a teenager than go out and play bars with your dad. He'll go out and get loaded, and I'll be up there with my band, and if any bar owner says, hey, you're too young to be here, I'm like, oh, I'm chaperoned or whatever. But, it was the whole punk thing that kind of got me into it. And I think a lot of that stems from when you're in a place that's, I would say all the punks were liberal, but you're in a place that isn't liberal, and you're being bossed around by Big Daddy over in New York City. It sets up this weird us versus them, way of life. Like, when your whole place that you exist in is being governed by somebody who's hundreds of miles away and doesn't know anything about your life. So you had, for years I thought I was a progressive, and so I'd go out and I'd sing all these songs about fighting the power and that whole happy nonsense with that group. And it took me almost a solid decade after that to kind of come to terms with the fact, well, I think that my punk rock element is kind of the other way. I don't think that all this stuff that, we want to go and help people and we want to raise the flag and for the cause, but that cause is winning and it's not doing any good. And this whole thing is just a big fashion project when you really boil down to it. And so, towards the end of high school, I kind of got out of that and started gravitating towards more of like the other side of music, which was, Pink Floyd and classic rock and shit. It's what you had back then. Because I don't know if you have any idea how old I am, but I'm one of the last vestiges of terrestrial radio.
How old are you?
33.
Okay. I'm 5 years behind you, so I think a lot of the cultural things will overlap, especially considering the kind of music that you make and, and what I notice. But go ahead.
But yeah, so just the age that I grew up in, like the radio stations were still a big deal back where I was, but their internet kind of hadn't burgeoned into what it is yet, and so you really only had a country station, a classic rock station, and a modern pop station. And I'll tell you, the modern pop station is always about 5 years behind what's anything resembling the pulse of America. In the past, 10 years, that's since shifted where, basically everything, even out in those small rural areas, is run by, computer systems in major cities, and it's all homogenized into one big thing. But you definitely had a separation of the type of music that was going on there versus the rest of the country.
Yeah, and when you were mentioning punk, that sort of reminds me, that punk is just sort of married with leftism in a way, and it's really unfortunate because it's such a powerful genre in this sort of dynamic of culture in America, and part of me just sympathizes so much with just that revolutionary spirit, whether or not it's leftism or not. And I mean, of course, I'm a hardcore libertarian, but still just part of me sympathizes with even the most radical leftists, because I know that they see a pattern that they see as something they don't really appreciate or believe in their value system. But it sucks to be sort of in the punk world and be more conservative, because if you really get into the history of punk, if you weren't kind of a leftist, you were like a neo-Nazi punk. You know what I mean? So it's like you're either with, it's that whole Antifa versus alt-right dynamic, that's been going back in this culture for a really long time on the radical ends of the spectrum.
I mean, and even now, you as a musician, you don't go on broadcast that you're anything other than a bleeding heart liberal.
Yeah.
Because that's what it is. Yeah, kind of. And it's, I guess what's frustrating is that, you look at, I always tell people, Bernie got a lot of things right. He saw all the problems. He just doubled down, was his view. Well, hey, the government screwed up, so let's have more government. And the libertarians go, well, if that's the problem, we have less of the thing that's a problem. That's the ultimate goal. So it's not not a problem with prescribing. It's a prescriptive problem as opposed to an acknowledgement problem. He gets it. He sees what's messed up. He just wants to run the other way as to how to fix it. And I think that's why, why with me, I always kind of thought I was one of those people, is because we all see the problems. We understand what's going on. I can get on a lot of those causes, but time has proven again and again that the ways that people tend to approach fixing them is not the appropriate way to fix them. It doesn't work.
I've got a similar background. I came from very progressive because, I was in a sort of music scene back in my hometown, and it was just the consensus opinion. That's just what you were if you were in that crowd. So, and I even got as far as to read Kropotkin and a little bit of Marx and Engels and stuff. And I mean, I got really hard into it until Ron Paul came along, and I was just saying in the last episode I released actually that yeah, I mean, there was just this guy who, he was in the GOP, but he was anti-war, and I was just like, wait, that challenges my preconceived notion of what a conservative is. So now I have to look into this guy.
And coincidentally, I think the guy that really forced me to come to grips with who I was is like, I remember I was a Carrie guy. I emptied literally a room of dishes and my entire kitchen out in my backyard. I was so pissed when Bush won the second time. And it was Michael Graves, the guy who took over singing for the Misfits in the late 90s, early 2000s. Who was very out about the fact that he was a conservative. Now, I tend to think he'd be more on the neocon side, but it opened me up to the fact that, hey, you don't have to follow the cookie cutter role of being a musician. And then, fast forward, I think for me it was the 2012 election that when Ron Paul came out, it started really opening my eyes. Well, hey, he wants all these there are leftist things that he's behind that are good things. Like, how does this all make sense? How do you make that into a worldview? And you follow that, and eventually you end up, discovering Tom Woods and Dave Smith and whatnot. And next thing you know, you're a hardcore ANCAP.
For sure. Just on the whole discussion of being in the light of the entertainment world, or at least, engaged in culture, there's this fine line that you certainly do walk when you are more on the right end of the traditional political spectrum. But some people in entertainment, they can kind of get away with it, like Frank Zappa, for example. I mean, a lot of my progressive friends really love Frank Zappa, even just, not just his music, but the things that he was saying and the activism that he stood for outside of entertainment and his content. Same with like Trey Parker and Matt Stone, for example, of South Park. They are avowed libertarians, or at least Trey Parker is, I think. If you make good content, it kind of doesn't matter to people. And I've always said, if I only consumed content from libertarian people, and if I always put entertainment in the media that I'm taking in through a libertarian lens, I just don't know what I would do with myself, because I would just be triggered all the time, and I would just be pissed at everything I hear, because nobody agrees with us for the most part, even though they do, because we believe in these principles that go back to like childhood. You just don't hurt people, you don't take their stuff, you do things consensually. That weird juxtaposition between what we know to be the moral and right thing.
Well, for me, the hardest one is actually stand-up comedy. And I still love my Aziz Ansari. You can tell that there's certain artists that I have difficulty watching, because it's like, I get your comedy, but dude, if you're gonna sit here and just preach to me about politics, like I guess if the politics are transparent, I don't mind. It's what makes up that person. But when you're watching like an Amy Schumer special, like last one, I couldn't even get through, because it's like, stop beating me over the head with your politics. Tell some jokes in between at least. It's that whole, hey, Trump, everybody thing. Yo, we get it. He sucks. Nobody likes it.
Sarah Silverman is probably the worst. I used to like her when I was a teenager too, and even when I was sort of coming more into the conservative libertarian end of the spectrum, I still liked it, and I still do. In fact, story time, I saw Patton Oswalt like the week after Trump got elected, or like a week after the election, because I had always and I still kind of do. I mean, I think he's funny, I think he's charming, but it's like at the same time, it was just beat me over the head with it. And I'm in Minnesota, so he's got an arena full of progressives. You know what I mean? So and I have a very particular experience with the election. It's weird. I happened to be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, during the election for training for work. So I was like around all of these blue collar guys. I'm a tradesman, so I was there for training, and I was just around all these Trump supporters, and all my friends are progressives, despite my own political ideology. Like most of the people I surround myself with are more progressive. So I'm not around Trump supporters, and actually getting to know them. I mean, I knew this before because I'm just like a normal person that, puts people through this like complex lens where you can't just judge them on their face. And but it just even showed me that these people, you talk to them and they really do think it's not about identity politics to them. It's about like their jobs are leaving. It's about their sons and daughters are going to war because these are the type of people that send their kids into the military. They're the lower to middle class. So they're the ones that can't afford college for their kids, so they decide to go into the Army and into the reserves, you know. So anyway, I think people just really need to open their eyes on that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? But
I just want Patton Oswalt to go back to telling jokes about Dungeons and Dragons. That's all I want.
Yeah. Okay. And then so I got back from that thing, and pretty much immediately the next day I went to this comedy, or his comedy show on the Saturday after the election there, and yeah, I mean, it was just like the world had ended, and he was just devastated. Their identity goes so much into because I feel like I just observed it and was like, wow, that happened. Whereas these people, their lives were completely turned upside down because they thought Mama Hillary was going to get in, and they weren't going to have to worry about anything in the government ever again because they already know what they're getting. They know they're getting a corrupt Goldman Sachs shill in the White House, and it's going to be business as usual. Now, oh shit, what do we do?
Yep, it's unfortunate.
Yeah, and even so arena full of progressives, and even they were starting to like heckle him and be like, okay, we get it. Like some lady was like, tell some other joke. She literally yelled that out. And you know what? I got to give him credit because he was like, he realized it. Like you could see a light. I was really close and I could see a light go off, and he just switched and he didn't talk about Trump the rest of the night, and he just did straight jokes. So, I mean, I've got a lot of respect for a lot of different people. So I just can only ever hope that I'm ever shown the same respect. Which is sort of why I decided to pivot more into the political realm of things. So,
well, and like I said, when Bush won that second time, I emptied my entire kitchen into my backyard. So I get being upset about things and irrationally investing yourself in the political process. I think when I went libertarian, that was one of the biggest things, is kind of divesting yourself from everything. It's like, look, we got to start thinking and talking about this stuff because what we've been doing isn't working.
So what did bring you over to libertarianism then? Because you're telling me this story about you used to be bleeding heart liberal, and now, what was it? Was there any one moment, or was it sort of a gradual thing?
Well, what I think it was is that, because, I'd spent so long in that scene, and, that whole thing, it's so causist. And so you kind of take on this identity, and eventually I came, it was one little thing here, one little thing there. I kind of got sick of listening to the liberal comedian, so somehow I ended up finding Big J. Okerson, and then got into Legion of Skanks through him, and found Dave Smith. And I think it was Dave Smith that really, I've been listening to them for at least 3 years, that really, really got me deep into the ANCAP stuff. I think around 2011, leading up to the 2012 election, started seeing Ron Paul out there. It was a gradual process, I guess, of coming to terms with who I am and not the label of what I thought I should be. Like, you can't be a punk rock guy and be conservative. But more and more, I just kept coming up with people that were clearly punk as fuck, and they found a way to make it work. And when it eventually came down to it, I think the least conformist thing you can possibly do, the most contrarian way to be out there, and the only way that really truly lives up to all the shit that we were spouting as far as being punks was libertarianism. All we wanted was everyone to be free, to be able to live their own lives and be able to live the best life that they could live. And it was the way that seemed to me to make the most sense of doing that, because everything else ended up leading to communism. And I think if you obviously, I sent you to my website, had a bunch of different types of music on there. And I think you can actually see, if you follow it long enough, like, or to actually go through the years and when things were released, gradually things started getting more overtly political. When I started getting into harder music, it became much easier to kind of get that part of me out in the music. Like I said, by Carriedbysix, I definitely had some themes in there that were me grappling with the existential situations of being a conservative.
It's isolating but liberating at the same time to sort of get into libertarianism and diverge from the consensus opinion of your culture that you usually surround yourself with. So,
well, there's not a lot of us, but for me, I now know who I am. Like, it makes sense. Like, all the weird little idiosyncrasies that didn't make sense other ways just kind of all fell into place. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think that,
being an individual.
Go ahead.
No, I said being an individual is a good thing. Like,
yeah,
finally.
Yeah, no. I mean, for the longest time, I mean, even when I first remember hearing of Ron Paul, I remember just sort of thinking about capitalism at that time, because I was like, this system of trading in private property is the source of all problems. And then just the more I got into political theory, because I mean, I didn't know shit. I didn't know, I didn't even know what the political compass was at that time. I was just so confused and young, and everything and nothing made sense to me. So like, it was just, it was a really transformative part of my life. And I think I learned a lot about myself. That's the biggest thing about coming to libertarianism. I think, understanding the power of rational self-interest, but at the same time, the rational self-interest of like caring for other people. So like that marriage of understanding the collective versus the individual, yet coming down on your morals and ethics down to this filtering of how the individual should act and what is the correct threshold for violence in any given situation. So yeah, it all just kind of clicked together for me, man.
Well, for me, and I think I always understood why capitalism worked. It's just people were telling me that's not what capitalism was. Like, I've said, like, since I was a kid, I've always espoused the belief that the most selfish thing anyone can do is help others.
Yeah, ethical egoism.
I've heard it so many different ways since I got into the movement, quote unquote. But it makes sense. It's like, if you really want to do better for society or do better for yourself, help other people. Mm-hmm. That's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and you know what really bugs me about just not even just progressives, but the right as well. It's like they want to just morally preen and call for this one policy as sort of, virtue signaling, so that they can say, at the end of the day, they can pat themselves on the back and say, oh, I supported this policy. I'm a good person. I'm a good boy, but they didn't actually do anything. You know what I mean? They didn't actually go and help anybody. So like, and I always tell people that when they like, if it's getting to the point where they're just like calling me names and like saying that I'm a bad person because I don't want the government doing this one thing, I just sort of remind them, what are you actually doing? Because I'll bet you anything I'm actually doing more, like not to like gloat or anything like that, but just to show that, just calling for a certain policy prescription does not seek, to actually be a sustainable means to an end.
Well, and you bring up like something in there, because I feel like I'm on the right, but as opposed to the left, but I didn't always, I guess, feel that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, I still hold a lot of like libertine values myself. Like I'm not like the Mises camp totally more aligns with me, and I agree with them probably more than any other kind of libertarian think tank.
But then when you're not a Christian in that community,
no,
you want to feel even more left out.
You know what's strange is
go and be an atheist libertarian.
Yeah, and I did notice on some comment threads that religion had came up with you, and I think I'm not super hostile towards Christians, because I see in some ways, regardless of what I think about how I should live my life, there is an astonishing number of Christians who do align with libertarian values, and there are a lot of libertarians Christian libertarians. So the same thing with the military guys.
I think we're outnumbered. Like, I think honestly, in the libertarian side of things, atheists are way outnumbered there. I come at it from an interesting, like, I for me, it's a struggle to be okay with religion, because I do tend, as a personal feeling, to be very antagonistic towards religion. But that has to do with my past. Like, I think it was my junior year, right around the time that I was confirmed into the Catholic Church. I'd actually considered going into the priesthood and was, looking through the options. I mean, and then eventually you get laid, and then you realize that was a horrible idea. Why would you ever think that?
At least be a Lutheran, man. You can have sex with a condom on and not have a kid.
But, going from that position, I was brought up Roman Catholic, and seeing, I guess, all the indoctrination. When the whole religion, it is just one big indoctrination after indoctrination from the time you're a child until you're completely brainwashed in. And, when I went off to college, I kind of looked and saw how all the other religions were ultimately the same thing. All the stories just kind of get rehashed around different, data points, but it's always the same message, the same thing. And I'm like, why is any one of us getting bogged down into the minutia? Why don't we just go and take these core messages of, I don't know, being a good human being?
Getting into religion when I was younger, I mean, I just read a whole bunch of different things about different religions. And at some point when you're trying to read things just to understand them, you end up sympathizing with them in a way. So as I was reading, I read Richard Alpert's book when I was younger, and that really resonated with me. And I was like checking out this whole, Hindu and, Indian culture kind of thing, and realizing all of the different directions that you can go with just this ancient religion, really, that is so interconnected with the cradle of civilization there, down towards the Middle East. So it's like I find myself sympathizing with people that I really shouldn't in other facets too, just like in reading about history, for example. You sort of get into reading about World War II, and I recently heard it described on a really good podcast that I recently started listening to called School Sucks. And they're talking about how there was no protagonist in World War II, but you end up sort of aligning with, like, as you're learning about these people, you end up sympathizing with them in some sort of way, just in the logic and the sense of self-preservation that certain people had. Like, if you actually understand what drove them to act, if you don't actually recognize the truth in these sort of patterns that we see throughout history, you're destined to repeat them. It's like that old cliche: if you don't learn from history, you're destined to repeat those failures, or however that quote goes. But yeah, man.
No, dude. And Brett does good work over there at School Sucks. I've been listening to that for at least a year now. I think he was on Tom Woods, kind of got me headed over there. I have a daughter that I plan on homeschooling, so for me it's important to get people that have alternative education as paramount.
Man, I've been wondering about how I'm going to approach that when I get to that point in my life. I mean, I'm getting to a point where I have to start making a plan for having a kid, if I'm going to do it.
Well, nah, it'll never happen if that's your goal. You got to not want it. You got to finally give up and not want it to happen, and be okay with things not doing that when it does. I think I tried to knock people up from the time I was 21. I always wanted to be a dad, and it was right around 30 that I said, no, you know what? I think I'm too old. I don't want to do it now. We're just gonna go and do what we're gonna do. And no sooner than that's my position do I do I have a daughter.
Just to bring it to sort of the weird progressive like instincts within me, I sort of feel like, I'm sort of lucky because I'm a dude. I really don't have to worry about getting old, and other than just my physical health when I want to play with my kid, which I'm pretty confident that I'm not like super in shape, but I try to stay mobile and things like that. So I just hope that I'm in a good enough, because if I really were to worry about it too much, my body's already beaten up the way it is, so it can't get much worse. But no, I mean, dudes really don't have to worry about it too much. So you can sort of have it in your mind to push it off. But, you know, even my girlfriend, you know, she's a little younger than me, and she's, you know, really pushing the wanting to have a kid thing. But
well, yeah, and at a certain point, like it's a big deal for them. Like they.
But yeah, anyway, man, we've been riffing a lot just on some random stuff here. Yeah, and I sort of just got away from your origin. You know, this is supposed to be more of a human interest format. But needless to say, I think you've changed a lot since you started getting into music. You know, for me, just as mostly an observer of music, I used to play a little bit. Like I can diddle around on a guitar, and I used to jam with friends and stuff like that. But I was never like a musician. But music has really impacted my life. If I go through my CD collection or my MP3 player and just I can replay memories. You know what I mean? Like it's like that sense of nostalgia that's instantaneous with a melody. It's like a smell that sort of transports you back into a specific time, as a specific memory. You know how it's just like an instantaneous nostalgia. So yeah, and, man, some of the music that you play really does hit those same sort of notes to some of the things that I was listening to when I was a teenager and younger adult, and still listen to, in fact. So yeah, man, you've gotten a really eclectic repertoire. The first thing I'd like to talk about, this is from, let me see, Carriedbysix. That's your band's name?
That is that band's name.
Okay. And I don't see what album this is from. Is it a self-titled album?
Self-titled.
Okay. So the song is called Pillars, and it's sort of a thrash metal song, at least in the initial onset, that you sort of run, or I mean, you hit the ground running, you know? It's just like it starts and just goes real hard and doesn't stop until about the first chorus, you know, and then it sort of tapers back a little bit.
The funny thing for me about Carriedbysix is that I actually got like the audition. It was the first band I joined when I moved to Cleveland, and I got the audition sending them Burns to the Soul stuff, which we'll touch on later. And literally I got the audition because the guys were just astounded that anybody that makes the music that I make would even want to be in their band. And they just wanted to see what the hell I'd do with it.
So you had never done real hard thrash metal before this?
Never. It was, but I like to build the resume. I like to do different things.
Oh, hell yeah.
And learn different vocal skill sets. Because to me, being a vocalist is all about the skill sets that you have. And that song in particular is always the one that I send people to if I want them to, like, if I think they're starting to pigeonhole me in what I do musically. I'm like, well, before you get too far ahead of yourselves, I did this too. And because that one it's from the beginning, that particular track. It's just is in your face, as you can imagine. Just a barrage of like flutter kick.
Yeah. The double kicks, man. The obligatory double kicks.
And that song to me is also interesting because it coincides with me really starting to move politically. I'm not sure how much of the lyric you could actually hear or if it are actually posted online. But the whole song is it's about, you know, my feelings with man's hubris, which why I hate central planning is because the idea that you think you can know enough to guide civilization is the most dangerous idea on the planet to me. And the whole song, I think, it's about, you know, genetic engineering and trying to take control of every aspect of our planet. And I think to me, the visual that I had was of these like superhuman monsters that we'd created specifically to protect ourselves from the other. You know, creating these armies of super soldiers that eventually, you know, as anything that we create would come to the conclusion of we ourselves are the enemy to ourselves.
Like
Yeah, and I do sense the political shift in here. You wrote this song, I take it.
In that band, I was a vocalist. I came in, like, they'd write the songs, I'd kind of weigh in on it, but it pretty much just put my flavor over top of what they were doing.
Well, regardless, the theme in this song is, I sense a lot of anti-war, at least instincts in it, which totally plays to my sort of, if I do have one emotional thing politically that really, really trips the moral outrage in me, it is, the war state, because coming from our perspective as libertarians, we believe in property rights, and probably the most important property right you have is to your body. So it's bad enough that these people's homes are being destroyed over in these foreign countries. They're losing their children and their parents and their loved ones. So it's like, it's murder and property destruction on a mass level and with impunity. So to me, that's just the worst thing that the state does. And as Dave Smith says, that is the issue of our time. It's why we're in going to be a bankrupt nation, not only morally, but fiscally.
Oh, absolutely. And what's funny is that, to me, it's the one through point that's always been there. The one thing that all those punk rockers from my youth that we could get into was to fight the war machine. And it's one thing that when I was, for a brief time, when I kind of thought I might be a Republican, that didn't sit well. I was like, well, you guys still want to just go and kill people, and that doesn't make sense to me. Like, you don't have good reason for it. When I found it to my way to where I am today, it was like, oh wait, you mean I can think war is shitty and still be concerned about the fact that, oh wait, and the war is part of the problem in the first place? Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and it ends up making a lot of sense. I can set aside a lot of things with a lot of people if we can at least agree that mass murder's wrong. I think that's just a basic coalition kind of thing. And when I have some really hardcore left friends, man, and I can get along with them just because I'm like, okay, we can get bogged down in the economics, but this thing is like the issue, and you can agree with me on that, right? Yeah, we both agree.
Yeah,
so
we can at least agree.
That's why
killing people's a bad idea.
Even like the paleo-libertarian, paleo-conservative thing, like we were talking about earlier, I might not. I actually totally don't agree with them on the culture thing. I'm in the process of getting out the second part of an episode with a guy just on the subject of culture, just in general, and that whole warfare there. And yeah, but at the end of the day, they don't want to bomb kids in the Middle East, and I don't care if it's just because they don't want to spend our money, our collective tax dollars, to go and do that. If that's their motivation to not want to commit mass murder, then I guess I'm all right with it.
And I know for me, like, and I know, like, with the Tom Woodses and the Mises camp gets accused of it a lot and getting lumped in with the different things. I think, I don't necessarily agree with the culture thing, because I think other cultures are good. I think to completely ignore that instinct of what was truly different about America, what is the thing that made us different, that allowed us to be, quote, so free for so long. You can't ignore the fact that the only real difference is that we had this belief in this idea of freedom. And that is completely unique to America. No other country has ever had that in the way we had it. In letting people in to, offset, I guess, the demographics, while I don't think we should be stopping it, we have to be cognizant of it as something that is in fact happening. At the end of the day, we keep going further and further to the left. and that's, part of the reason.
And this sort of conversation reminds me that like there's this quote from Dave Smith, and these are the kinds of things that like really make a person uncomfortable. Like, this will really piss off a progressive. Would you, a black person that came over here and was enslaved, right? Would they have been better off, their ancestry, staying in Africa? Like, that kind of shit just like makes your brain hurt a little bit, because you're like, oh shit, you're right. America has a better standard of life than those places. And so even though this fucked up thing happened in our history, corrected for history, it's like, that's a really hard thing to grapple with sometimes, especially if you're a former progressive, you know?
Even if you don't go so blatant as that, I mean, let's be honest. Black people were selling black people in Africa. That's where the Dutch bought them from. And if I'm incorrect, I believe, like, say, South America, for instance, apartheid ended after the civil rights movement in America did. So, there's a few different ways you can even go with that. All of it is kind of irrelevant to the point that the world is getting better in many ways as far as standard of living goes for everybody, and to ignore that's kind of ludicrous. I wish the wrong side would stop taking credit for it, though.
Yeah, jumping out in front of the parade. Back to music. So you brought up your solo project wherein you make this electronic sort of breakbeat indie stuff, I guess, if I had to give it little genre qualifiers there.
I've done very little with that music because I don't know what to call it either. I make it and it's very me.
Yeah. It reminds me of a lot of emo stuff I used to listen to when I was younger, and I'll still put on a Death Cab for Cutie album, when no one else is around. That's like still my guilty pleasure. And so this kind of reminds me of some of that sort of music that I used to listen to when I was younger.
And I definitely came through that whole thing for sure. I definitely loved my Death Cab back in that day. See, that whole era, I guess, in time kind of coincides with my college career. So, the 4 years that I was in college, kind of finding myself as a person, quote unquote, also coincides with that whole movement. So I think it being the predominant type of music for a given time definitely informed what I would go on to make. The EP, Most of the Best from the Worst of the Last, whatever it was. I don't even remember what I called it. I remember it was long. I like long titles. That whole album the whole EP was actually originally written on my cell phone in this little app called Chordbot, and I just started structuring out chord progressions that I thought sounded cool and kind of came up with instrumentation, and then I'd slap that on my computer and start going through actual VSTs and whatnot. I don't know if that's too inside baseball for your people, but
I'm sure some of them get it, but I don't.
And yeah, we'll get you there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I recorded just MIDI on my cell phone and then put that into a computer and started layering virtual instruments on there. And I'm sure if you listen to anything in there, it's headache inducing to, I think, anyone who's not me. But that's also why it makes sense to me, because it's all saturation. There's so much going on at any given time. It's just like an amorphous blob of sound. And that's why I like it. Like, why do I only want 2 vocalists? I want 10 vocalists. I need 30-part harmony. How do I make that happen? And especially on that, the particular track you said we're going to talk about was a lot of that. But when I'm doing that stuff, like, because of the kind of music that comes out of me as far as, the style, Mother is a big influence on me. And they're much better at getting the whole somber, dark lyrics over, upbeat, danceable music than I could ever be at it.
You'll never understand the words that I've got, flowing like a fountain now. And I'm sure that you'll be worried a lot about the way that people look at you. It always seemed I was a little toy. Stronger boy, that's just not the way they made me, girl. And you're walking away with my heart in pieces, making light of the damage you've done again. This isn't just a temper tantrum, girl, just a reaction to your fickle taste. I'm sure I'll never really understand just what you couldn't find in my embrace. It's not that I can't move along, or that I'm
but it's hard to kind of get political and get into stuff like that. Some of the songs kind of burgeon on there, but you know, a lot of it's just me bitching about girls. Because what else do you do in pop? What else do you do in pop music? You bitch about girls.
For sure. That's one thing that I really used to appreciate about some of that more emo music too, is because it was like, music that made you want to kind of bounce around and dance, but it was about like slitting your wrists and like, being super bummed out about stuff.
I used to collect John Cusack movies and High Fidelity. He's got that one line that always gravitated with me, which is, do I listen to pop music because I'm depressed, or am I depressed because I listen to pop music? The chicken or the egg of the whole setting. Yeah,
for sure. So yeah, and then kind of going back to more of the heavy stuff. I've got this song from Purveyors of Fiction. That's the band name, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, and the album is Hollow Notes, and this is sort of more of a southern rock, kind of rockabilly sounding, kind of, if I were to throw genres at it. But yeah, I mean, you've got in this song, I noticed like a strong marriage of kind of old school heavy metal and blues. Like you bridge that gap really well, including the legit harmonica solo that ends up in there. So yeah, it's got like this sort of southern sort of jig to it, but it's super high energy sort of rock sound. So yeah, I really dig this one.
Yeah, that was the most recent project that I've had performing out live in the past couple years. I was drunk at a concert watching some other friends one night, and this young kid was really nice, and I told him I'd start a band with him, and so I started a band with him. He wasn't very good at the beginning, but I saw promise, and he like really, really wanted to do it. And so I can say 3 or 4 years we did that, and that record was kind of the culmination of what we were getting together. In particular, like I always tell people with music, especially like with live bands that I'm in, and I've got another project kind of along that veins I'm working on right now, that I always thought that all the vampire orgies I saw in movies had the wrong kind of music. Like I didn't want all that like dancey club music when you're creeping around in that red club. I always thought it should be like some dirty, heavy music. It's like I think it was when I discovered Queens of the Stone Age. It was eye-awakening. It was like, oh my God, it's dark, but it's sexy as hell. My dad is a big blues guy. I grew up listening to Eric Clapton. He's also a big rockabilly guy. So I grew up listening to the Stray Cats and whatnot. And eventually, they had bands like the Black Keys came out, and it kind of married a lot of the punk aesthetic to the old blues thing. But it never quite got the swagger that I thought you could get. And so that particular song, Orson Wells, that we were talking about, is all the things that I think kind of make me who I am. It's, just this love for the swagger of rock and roll. But, growing up in the outskirts, like there's always kind of an underpinning of country still being somewhere in my blood. I always used to tell a metaphor for one of the other songs on the record about, it was gussy up, and to me, that's a term that people use where I'm from, about getting dolled up and going out, kind of cleaning shit off a pig, as they would call it. And the guitar player for that project, he would always pick on me about the fact that it's a song about pigs, and I'm like, dude. But it's at the end of the day, like, why the hell do I have an analogy about pigs? Does that make sense to anybody who's never lived out in the sticks?
Right. No, it translates to me, man. I mean, I was in the pork production state. Like, Iowa is totally, yeah. I mean, lipstick on a pig, that was a very common idiom, and that I still use. I use it at work all the time because you get really shitty pieces of equipment and buildings, and you're just like, well, I can slap a Band-Aid on it. It'll be like lipstick on a pig, but it'll work, you know? So anyway.
Yeah, and so back to the song we're talking about was Orson Welles, and I was working on learning how to do the cross harp method of harmonica, which is, you know, essentially the blues method, where you actually play out of key, but you're playing notes that are out of or in key on a different harmonica to get the bends in key. It's a really, really weird style of play. And
I could see that, I guess. I don't know much about the music theory behind it. Like I was saying earlier, I was just sort of a diddler, but I had a harmonica myself, and it's really fun to play.
Oh, absolutely. And when you start playing out or playing with other musicians, like the key becomes very important. Like, so you can play straight harp, which if someone's in the key of C, you just play C and it gives you a major diatonic scale. Or you can play, you know, that same C harp in I believe it's a key of A minor, and it'll still sound appropriate in there because you're playing the minor scale or major scale over the minor. Well, cross harp is this other weird thing where you're playing, I can't remember exactly how far it's out, but the idea is that some of the notes that are there in the diatonic scale coincide, but it's actually the notes that you have to bend in and out of that go into the key itself. So it's it's an interesting way of doing things, but it's what makes that whole blues sound. That song's also funny because it's got so many guitar players on it to me. We kept going through members. Christina, our second guitar player, ended up moving off to, went to Berkeley. She thinks she's still at Berkeley right now, up in Massachusetts. And we also had like one of my buddies, Andy, who used to be in this band called The Approach and the Execution out of Cleveland out here. And they're a big power metal group. He's the guy who tears up that ripping outro solo on it, where it's just all the tapping and, you know, guitar harmonies and whatnot. But to me, that song was it's funny on so many levels. I settled on the name Orson Wells because the whole song was written about the idea that, you know, it's all about a guy who feels he's been wronged in his life and people don't appreciate his genius, quote unquote. And so he decides to go on a killing spree. And I arrived at that whole scenario because was it 195 is the number I keep bringing up in it, was how the song was always called 195 because that was the BPM that the guitar player wrote it at. And so he just kept calling it out. And eventually I just worked the number into the lyrics and wrote a whole story about what the hell 195 means. And then you get to the end of it, and 196 is when he blows his own head off or whatever. But it was, yeah, the whole thing is just, you know, a disgruntled guy who's like, well, fuck you, I'm important, and this is why. And to me, Orson Welles as a historical figure, like, that's his real legacy, is the idea that he was great, and the world just didn't understand him. Which is the metaphor for all of humanity in my world. We're all the greatest thing in the world and nobody understands it. Well, eventually nobody's the greatest thing in the world if we're all the greatest thing in the world. So let's just go back to being normal people, folks.
Who are you to think you'll ever get me? Little man, who are you to usurp control? When 95 will be the price we're missing. Genius, 95, that'll breathe the more. I'll take no more, living on a foot. I'll take mine, back for the missing. I'll take no more.
southern rock bent to it, and you were talking, and you're describing the tone of the song. It reminds me of a band. Do you know who He Is Legend is?
I definitely know of them. Couldn't place anything offhand, but I know I've listened to them in the past. I've reached the point now of critical mass where I think I'm starting to push out things that I've listened to because there's just been too many of them. A lot of people give up on music when they kind of come out of their 20s. Whatever they liked in high school and college is kind of where they stay. And to me, that is a slow death. I can't imagine ever wanting to do that. So I'm always out looking for new music and different music. And it gets harder and harder to do over the years. When you play as much music as I do and you have a wife and a kid, when the hell do you have time?
I totally understand what you're saying about the whole desire for, swagger and whatnot in this sort of, it's a very particular genre, the whole just southern rock vibe. It's like, it's all about having a few beers and, it's like the country life mixed with rock and roll. And I just love the aesthetic.
Are you a fan of Eagles of Death Metal at all?
Hell yeah.
Yeah, and I'm a big Jesse Hughes fan.
Is that, he's in Queens of the Stone Age too, that dude?
No, Joshua Holmes, the guy in Queens of the Stone Age. Jesse Hughes is the giant mustache that fronts Eagles of Death Metal.
Okay.
He's the guy that had, did all the interviews and pissed all the people off talking about the Bataclan situation because he is incredibly conservative, like hardcore Christian right. Again, I was listening to him doing. Yeah, no, he basically he came out and said he believes that the people at the Bataclan, it was an inside job, that kind of deal.
Oh Jesus!
He was on was it Kevin or Chewing It with Kevin and Steve the other day. I was listening to it, and he was talking about the person he wanted to be when he was growing up most was Ronald Reagan. So just an interesting kind of guy. And if you know anything about Queens of Stone Age lore, like he used to be in high school with Josh. That's how they know each other. And like they used to play soccer together. Which is always funny to imagine, like your rock and roll heroes being guys in high school on the soccer team. But to me, I love rock and roll, and that's part of what always drew me to rockabilly. And it's such an underrepresented kind of music anymore. Like there's a lot of rock out there, there's a lot of hard rock, and there's a lot of metal, but nobody makes like actual rock and roll. They basically, in my world, the only people that still make rock and roll are Eagles of Death Metal, and it's that country swagger with the blues. It's this weird marriage, and so much of that marriage is a lot of what I really gravitate towards. When I was a kid, I think growing up, Weezer was always my favorite band in the world, and as an adult, I'm like, I don't even know how I can really, like, I like the music still, like, Only in Dreams will always be the greatest song ever written to me, but the music, I'd blow my brains out having to listen to it all the time, because it's kind of depressing. I want some upbeat guitars every now and again, and something's going to make you bounce.
So yeah, end of the day, you've got a lot of different musical influences, and yeah, it's almost like, man, I just don't see how you have any time to like have like a full-time job too, and you're doing all this music stuff, and yeah, it's just crazy.
It's like I said, it's a lot of figuring out what you can put on autopilot. It's one of those. I know you through the Jason Stapleton message boards, and I listening to him and Tom Woods have kind of made me really think about how I do things over the past couple of years, and I want to improve myself, improve my position in life, and do better for my wife and my kid. While the only way to do that is to make certain things where you don't have to do them to do them. When it comes to the original music, it takes up a lot less time in my life because I don't necessarily play out a whole lot with the original projects. I'll, schedule something maybe once a month just to go and have some kind of outlet. But the problem is nobody's paying you to do that. So for me, it cuts out of the bottom line. And while as much as I enjoy working on machines and computers at work, that's not really what I want to do the rest of my life. So, is anything I can do to build my own income outside of all that, which I do with cover gigs.
Yeah, and in that cover gig, I saw you share doing it was a cover of Roundabout, progressive rock. I'm a huge progressive rock fan. Even though I'm like, if I were to really list out the number of progressive rock bands that I actually know and like, it's actually pretty small, but there's so much stuff just in that small list that I have, like Gentle Giant and Genesis, King Crimson, that sort of, vein, Porcupine Tree and Steve Wilson.
Yeah, my guitar player's kind of been working on getting me into the Porcupine Tree stuff. Some of it I've heard, I dig. Some of it I'm kind of like, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that.
For sure, yeah. I mean, like, there's sort of a lot of modern day progressive, and this is sort of what turns me off to some of it, is it's just formulaic. Like, they're just going off of this one archetype of, spazzy kind of, prog rock breakdowns that are just, like, I love them, but once you hear, it's just hard to make it original anymore. After the greats have done it, they're standing on the shoulders of giants, and it's pretty easy to fall off that shoulder.
For me, like, when it comes to modern prog, I mean, I look at modern prog as being so much the gent movement. And while I think a lot of the gent music is very, very repetitive, every now and again you'll find an artist like, for me, 12 Foot Ninja.
Oh, you showed me or mentioned them on one of the message boards, and yeah, I was really into that.
I mean, to me, it's like Mr. Bungle 2.0. It's Mike Patton doing the weirdest thing he could. Obviously, Mike Patton's not in the band; it's a bunch of weird Australian guys. But they're also very in-house and make their own videos. Like, do it, like, everything's kind of DIY in a lot of respects with them. I think they just posted a video on their YouTube last night. I was dying because it was their guitar player restoring an old Lego collection of his and finding all the missing pieces. And so I literally spent 10 minutes watching a guy build this toy. I've never owned the toy. I liked Legos. I'm like, well, whatever. But yeah, as far as progressive modern music goes, that's more where I like to go, where they play with the genres and play with the styles. I mean, to me, modern pop music in general, thing that's weird about it is that every style is represented concurrently so much that there is no genres anymore. So it all just sounds like one big homogenized mess. Whereas I like all those genres as what they are. Is there any way you can do each pieces and parts and kind of make things their own? Because I'm sick of listening to everything sounding the same.
Yeah, there is that one thing about pop music where, and it's kind of a nebulous term, right? Pop music. There's always good stuff, whether you want to admit it or not. Like Prince. That was some pretty revolutionary stuff, both culturally and musically. So I think we have to hand it to even those people that we might not listen to every day, but we still have to give them cultural significance. And even like Kanye, as much as you don't like him, he did shape pop music right now.
Oh, as much as I don't like Kanye as a person more than anything, but I mean, dude, Kanye had a bunch of great albums, and like Kanye is what, I think 2 years older than me. Like I was in college while he was out releasing albums. So
really, I guess I didn't realize he was that young.
He's not. Don't believe he's in his 40s yet for sure. But he kind of was releasing music, the soundtrack of my high school career. Like, if you weren't listening to the indie stuff like the Death Cab, the other side of it was you're going out clubbing and you're listening to, Kanye or Ludacris was huge in that time, and I'm a huge fan of Ludacris. And in both cases, they represent what I think is really the most important thing for any musician, which is voice. It's something personally I struggle with. I've become really good at doing different things, but I don't know that I necessarily have my voice because I do a lot of different things with it. But I love the fact that there's not a single track you've ever heard that if Ludacris starts rapping, you don't immediately know it's him.
Right.
If Kanye starts rapping, it's Kanye.
That's a good point.
In the same vein, like, if Mark Lanigan of Screaming Trees was on a track, you're going to know it's Mark Lanigan.
Deep cut, by the way.
It gets over... When we were talking pop music, a couple years ago, there was this artist, Gautier, that had this song, Someone That I Used to Know. And it was a fairly popular song. He had this girl, Kimbra, that was on the track too. And Kimbra is New Zealand pop star. I'll say pop star loosely. But her music is very, very, very pop. And it's some of the most interesting music you'll ever care to listen to. Her album Vow is beginning to end. Like, you'll hear it go from some serious, we'll say Beyonce influence to Tears for Fears and, all the way back. Like this, some 1930s, 40s stuff. But as a musician, the songwriting is unbelievable. So it's like, I don't even get mad at pop music for being pop music, but I do get upset when Lorde, who wrote one of the most abysmal songs I've ever heard in my life, doesn't get or gets more recognition than a genuinely talented artist from the same place.
Yeah, and I guess that just kind of goes to show, too, sort of playing back into the whole fact that pop is such a nebulous genre. Even someone, I don't know, I consider like Bjork, for example. That's like, it's avant-garde, I guess, but that's a sort of pop, and that's revolutionary kind of stuff, in my opinion.
Bjork kind of depends on the album you're listening to, what she is, I guess.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of shit out by Bjork, but I mean, her first breakout album was that was like a game changer, kind of. I mean,
and are you considering that as Bjork after the Sugar Cubes?
What?
Yeah, Bjork used to front a band called the Sugar Cubes back in the 80s.
Oh, I didn't even know about this.
They were kind of like new wave. Bjork came out of that whole thing and then really, really took off when she started doing her thing, which was very, very avant-garde. But in the same vein, I think she still worked with a lot of the people she used to work with from those days, even when she did break out. But yeah, you said breakout, and I'm like, oh, are we talking the real breakout or the breakout? I always laugh because a lot of people will talk about the Goo Goo Dolls' first album, Boy Named Goo, which had a couple good tracks on it, but it was like their sixth album that they'd been doing since the mid-'80s, which included like some, they were definitely I won't say a hard punk band, but a solid pop punk band for years before they became what they became. Like even like with some thrash influences on some of the songs, which is, to me, it's always interesting, but it's the whole world of music kind of has its own sort of thing going on there. For sure. I'll ramble forever, man. I just go. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. No, that's what this is all about. Just chatting about music, seeing what people think. I think we should wrap there. You've been more than generous with your time, man. I really do appreciate it.
Nope, not a problem.
Why don't you sort of give the listeners any plugs, places where they can find you and your music?
If you're in the Cleveland area, you can look up tobraproductions.com, and it'll tell you where I'm doing stuff live. If you're not anywhere around, don't want to see me live, you just want to listen to some of the music I create, gowiththefrorecords.bandcamp.com is where I post all the stuff I've done over the years. I currently have 3 projects working right now on releasing material, but none of it's quite ready to be going on it. Puma Thurman is, the one project. I've got Honey Kills is the other. I'm not entirely sure what the third band's even going to be called at this point, though. We'll record the album and then we'll figure it out. Who knows? Maybe we'll just do it off of SEO and see which one shows up on Google the best.
There you go. All right, Mr. Nick Pecone, I really do appreciate you coming on. I had a lot of fun. Yeah, maybe we can talk again sometime on here.
It sounds good, boss. It's good talking to you, Trey.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe on your way out and find us on Facebook at facebook.com/subversionwebcast.